Southern Utah was isolated, religiously zealous, and deeply distrustful of outsiders. And the Baker Fancher party, unaware of the firestorm they had stumbled into, had just unknowingly arrived at the worst possible moment. You're listening to True Crime of the Historical Kind. This is part two of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the siege and the slaughter. If you missed part one, you may want to go back and listen there first. The people of southern Utah knew about the Baker Fancher party long before they ever saw them. From the moment the immigrants entered Utah territory, news of a wealthy wagon train from Arkansas was causing alarm. Brigham Young had already given instruction to not trade with outsiders as they stockpiled supplies in preparation for the Utah War. Yet the Baker Fancher party had no idea they would be cut off from opportunities to replenish their supplies. The Mormon Road, as it was known, was the standard route for families to take toward California, and thousands had taken it without incident. Finding the Mormons inhospitable, to put it lightly, would have been confusing and frustrating, but there wasn't another practical route. They had no choice but to carry on without new supplies. The steep wall of the Wasatch Mountains forced wagon traffic south along a narrow corridor, and Mormon communities had developed along that line, making their settlements impossible to avoid. As the Baker Fancher party made their slow trek south, stories were forming that this train was full of rude, combative, and disruptive people. Some claimed there was a tall man among them, called the German or the Dutchman, which to them was like the same thing, but they thought he was speaking negatively about the church. Others began to say that members of the group were taunting locals by boasting that they had the same gun that had killed Joseph Smith. And keep in mind, most of the people in the Baker Fancher group were coming from Arkansas, the same state that their beloved apostle Parley P. Pratt had just been murdered in. In this pre war hysteria environment, a complaint became an insult, an argument became a threat, a story heard secondhand became something remembered as fact. And if anything went wrong, who would be blamed but these outsiders? That's exactly what happened when a spring near Corn Creek seemed to be contaminated. Cattle had died along with at least one native child. Historians believe this was probably caused by either naturally produced arsenic or contamination from their own livestock. But without modern knowledge to the nearby Mormon settlements, this was the evidence of persecution they were expecting. In reality, the immigrants had already traveled over 1,000 miles on foot or by being jolted around in a wagon over rough terrain. Their intention was simply to rest their cattle, allow them to graze, perhaps re oil their wagons, make repairs, then be on their merry way for the last grueling leg of the journey, crossing the Mojave Desert. There's no evidence that any of these interactions even happened, but even if they were upset or frustrated that Mormons refused to trade with them, they still had no reason to do harm or to linger in Utah any longer than they had to. So, when the Baker Fancher party rolled into the Mountain Meadows clearing in early September 1857, they may have sensed the hostility from the Mormons, but they almost certainly did not realize just how closely they were being watched or how seriously some of the local leaders viewed their presence. Councils in Parowan and Cedar City were already taking place to decide what should be done about the wagon train. Men like John D. Lee, Isaac C. Hay, and William Dame increasingly framed the Baker Fancher party as a problem that had to be dealt with. Fear, suspicion, and ongoing religious rhetoric certainly drove much of that thinking, but there's another possible motive here, whether they admitted it or not. Southern Utah settlements were struggling, supplies were scarce, tensions were high, and these immigrants from Arkansas appeared well provisioned. With over 100 people carrying everything of value they could manage in order to prepare them for both the trek and to start a new life in California, they had the same supplies Utahns were trying to stockpile. They had cattle, horses, clothing, tools, ammunition, bedrolls, preserved food, and even the wagons themselves were all immensely valuable on the frontier. In the eyes of the locals, the Baker Fancher's resources would be difficult not to covet. Though what the local leaders were trying to convince others of was that this wagon train was dangerous, that they were here without permission, and that they were against them. They declared that they must act, and soon a plot was forming. The men proposed that they should encourage local Paiute bands to attack the immigrants as a protective necessity. There was already an expectation that they would ally with local tribes for what they thought would be the imminent clash of the Utah War. In fact, Brigham Young had just met with Native leaders for this same reason, though he was encouraging people to be careful with their relationships so that they could maintain alliances for the battles ahead. In addition, since wagon trains were always understood to be vulnerable, attacks by Native groups were an ever present concern in pioneers' minds, even though they were far less common than they feared. Regardless, the leaders knew this, and by orchestrating the Paiute attack, they could deny any direct involvement of the Mormons, while not having to commit the less than savory parts of the violence. They could frame this as just another tragic story of the risks pioneers faced on the frontier. But wait, who were these men to make decisions of this magnitude? They didn't hold that kind of authority. And part of that intense religious rhetoric that was going around Utah Territory was obedience. With the structure of the church hierarchy, it would be undeniable that Brigham Young, the territorial governor and the prophet of the church, would be the only person with the authority to make such decisions. But Young was around 250 miles north in Salt Lake. While local leaders had no power without his blessing, they had heard the fiery words of protecting Zion, of blood atonement and righteous vengeance, to be weary of outsiders, that non Mormons were going to persecute them, and the possibility of declaring martial law. Just weeks earlier, they had been visited by George A. Smith, who was an important leader in the church. He came to the southern settlements to reinforce the instructions of Brigham Young, which amplified the region's fears and sense of impending doom to an all-time high. Whether they were doing what they believed they were instructed to or were taking matters into their own hands has been endlessly debated. What we do know is that they chose to execute this plan. John D. Lee began to meet with local Paiute leaders to encourage them to join the attack on the wagon train. He stated that these people were a threat and there would be compensation in the form of cattle, which by now everyone in the area was aware of how much cattle they had with them. Paiute motivations here were complicated. Lee's long-standing relationship with Paiute families made him a key intermediary. As we know, he had even fostered Native children and been the area's Indian farmer for years. The Paiutes needed supplies just like everyone else, especially with the encroaching Mormon settlements that were taking their resources and causing their population to dwindle. Though not all accepted this allegiance, ultimately an agreement was made with some of the Paiutes. The Mormon militiamen, known as the Nauvoo Legion, prepared for an attack. They dressed themselves up in native clothing and painted their faces. They were ready for war. On the morning of September 7th, Mountain Meadows was quiet. The Baker Fancher party had their wagons arranged in a loose circle for the night. The grassy pastures and clean water had been a welcome relief. As they slept, the militia and Paiutes crept towards them. The plan was to unleash an attack before they were awake. The militia leaders knew the pioneers would always be at least somewhat on guard for an ambush, so their best bet was to take them by surprise. They expected the Paiutes to rush in to attack before the men could grab their weapons. But that did not unfold exactly as the white leaders intended. For some reason, the Paiutes were stalling, or there was miscommunications and confusion amongst the ranks. And the morning began to pass. People were stirring, getting up, making fires, and going about their day. The situation was already going wrong. Then a shot rang out. Accounts vary on who fired the first shot, but nonetheless, it alerted the party to danger. Others took this as a sign to attack, so gunfire began to erupt from the surrounding hills. The emigrants rushed to circle the wagons tighter and grab their weapons, yelling to each other that they were under attack. In the confusion, 7 to 10 emigrants were killed instantly. More were wounded as panic spread, Wagons were overturned, oxen scattered, and women screamed. But the Baker Fancher party didn't break. Under assault, they managed to regroup and return fire. This was all wrong. The leaders of the militia had expected a quick raid, and now they were locked in a standoff. Worse for them yet, the party could have seen the white men dressed up as Paiutes, so now, if the immigrants escaped, they could expose Mormon involvement and alert the U.S. troops. So while the initial attack was a failure, they couldn't just let them go. They were now witnesses of Mormon crime. Isaac Haight knew the situation was spiraling. Hoping to halt the violence or at least deflect the blame, that afternoon he sent a writer named James Haslam to Salt Lake. Haslam was a trusted messenger and would ride day and night to carry the urgent letter to Brigham Young. Haight's message asked for guidance. What should they do with the immigrants passing through Utah territory? In the meantime, a siege began. The Baker Fancher party were surrounded. They were cut off from the nearby spring, but they were not surrendering. They dug defensive trenches and chained the wagon circle even tighter. For the next few days, shots were sent back and forth, and white flags were being offered for the Baker Fancher party to surrender, but they rejected them. Under the cover of darkness, 3 men from the Baker Fancher party managed to slip out. They were attempting to reach the nearest settlement of Cedar City and ask for help. They managed to get about 10 or 15 miles away. Then they were intercepted by militiamen at a nearby spring. 2 of the men were shot and killed. The man known as the Dutchman was wounded, but managed to escape and return to the wagon camp to warn them. Now they knew for certain white men were a part of the attack. The leaders of the militia were already growing anxious, and this just intensified their fear. Each day brought the risk of discovery by non-Mormons or even the U.S. troops, and gave participants the chance to have second thoughts. Clearly, the Baker Fancher party was prepared to fight for their lives, and that's exactly what they did for 5 long days. Inside of the wagon circle, time stretched painfully. They buried their dead within the encampment and waited. Every sound had the potential of being another wave of attack. They kept a constant watch, scanning the hills and brush for movement. They couldn't have known it, but their attackers were arguing amongst themselves, and doubt had begun to creep into the ranks of the militia. Some of the militiamen were questioning why they were ordered to do this, and the Paiutes were realizing the white settlers were expecting them to take most of the blame. There were many that abandoned the siege and left, angry with the Mormon leaders. But for the men who were already knee-deep in this mess, they continued trying to come up with a solution. Though there was some hesitancy and disagreement, they ultimately decided on a final plan of action. After the long days of the siege, desperation had settled thick over the Baker Fancher camp, as their water was running out, ammunition was low, and their food dwindled. So, when a white flag appeared in the distance with approaching men asking to negotiate, this time they agreed, and John D. Lee entered the circle. Lee was calm, measured, and persuasive. He told the emigrants that he was serving as the local Indian Affairs liaison and that the Paiutes were open to calling a truce. Though he tried to hide it, John D. Lee was terribly nervous. He didn't know if they would agree to the terms or if they suspected the white men. He would later describe this moment as one of unbearable tension. The emigrants were battered but alive, proving that they were far harder to eliminate than anyone had anticipated. Whatever doubts Lee carried, he buried them beneath a performance. He spoke calmly, he offered reassurance, and framed the surrender as safety. This man looked them in their pleading eyes and comforted them. He assured them that they could pass unharmed. All they had to do was surrender their weapons and supplies. They would need to be escorted away in separate columns, sorting them by the men, the women, and older children, then the younger children. Then they would be allowed to walk away. But the hesitation was palpable. Completely disarming themselves was to put over 100 lives in the hands of this stranger. And many refused. The suspicion was confirmed when several people in the camp spoke about how they knew white men were among the attackers and the Mormons should not be trusted. This information coming straight from the party may have inadvertently given Lee even more resolve to move forward with this, what most people would consider a diabolical plan. Because he now knew for certain that Mormon involvement would be discovered if they were allowed to live. Despite the lack of trust, the overall consensus was to accept this truce. The decision came from sheer desperation. They would die if they remained in the siege. So the emigrants, weak, exhausted, and terrified, but with no better option, surrendered. On September 11th, under the bright sun of the high desert, the plan unfolded. The party was divided into the groups that would leave them completely defenseless. The men were accompanied by armed Mormon militia members alongside them. The plan was to stretch the line out, then a command would be given. But to those who later recounted the event, recalled that this process seemed painfully slow. Sweat and tension ran high, as the command should have been shouted already. Finally, it came. Halt, do your duty. And in a sudden, brutal turn, the men beside the immigrants turned toward the completely defenseless men and opened fire at point blank range. As the shots rang out, war whoops filled the air as the Paiutes and more militia dressed as Paiutes emerged from the brush and descended on the women and children. The women began to run towards the column of men for protection, only to be shot as they ran. More were killed by knife or tomahawk. It was sheer horror and chaos. The tall Dutchman was seen carrying a small infant, and both were shot. Children were ripped from their mothers. Siblings watched as their brothers and sisters and parents died in front of them. Those still standing threw themselves into the sagebrush to hide, but were soon found and stabbed. The screams of wailing children filled the air. Those clinging to life were bashed in the head from where they lay on the ground. It was an absolutely brutal and ruthless attack. All told, somewhere between 120 and 140 men, women, and 37 of them being children were massacred. Entire families were wiped out. Only 17 small children were spared. The rationale was to only allow those too young to remember the event to live. Though, according to future testimony of one of the surviving children, Nancy Safrana Huff, said this: "At the close of the massacre, there was 18 children still alive. One girl, some 10 or 12 years old, they said was too big and could tell, so they killed her, leaving 17. The 17 small children were all under the age of 6. Many believe this cutoff point was not only because they thought the kids couldn't remember, but because it's close to the age of 8, which in Mormonism is seen as the age of accountability and is the age of baptism. But it was never explicitly recorded. The children were rounded up like captured livestock. Kicking and screaming, they were forced to go with the very people who they had just watched kill their families. Then the looting began. They descended on the valuables, helping themselves to take the animals and anything of value from the dead. Even their clothes were stripped from their bodies. When they got to see what was left of the ammunition and food, it was clear why the settlers surrendered. They didn't have enough supplies to survive much longer. The men left the dead where they lay and walked or rode away from Mountain Meadows covered in blood, holding what loot they could as they went back to their houses. In the nearby settlements, much of the property was redistributed, auctioned off, or quietly absorbed into local use as Paiutes took their share of the cattle. Some of the stolen goods were even inventoried by local leaders under the pretense of reimbursement. Within hours, the 17 newly orphaned children were being handed out to Mormon families, much like the other commodities. Some of the children were given to barren women or women who had lost their children on the harsh frontier, while others were taken in as playmates for families with young children of their own. Much like John Calvin Miller, age 6, who was adopted by a Cedar City family eager for another son, while sisters Prudence and Georgia Dunlap were separated and sent to homes in nearby settlements. Though there were several sets of siblings that survived, All 17 were sent to live in separate homes. Many of the families who took them in believed that they were acting mercifully. The children were washed, clothed, and given new names. Most were given blessings, which is a Mormon religious ritual of naming a child and essentially welcoming them into the family and asking God to bless their lives. Though the children were too young to articulate it yet, to them, this wasn't charity. They had just watched their parents die. Some would see the faces of the men who killed their families out in the community. One little girl recalled seeing her dead mother's clothes on another woman. As they cried out for their family, they were being told to not speak of it. The notion that these deeply traumatized children would never remember the event was as foolish as it was cruel. Because many would remember, as we will see. In real time, immediately after the massacre, Lee, Haight, Dame, and others were shaken but resolute. They knew if they were discovered, the consequences could be devastating, both for them personally and for the broader Mormon community. So they gathered the participants and even local civilians and instructed them to never speak of what happened. They swore oaths of secrecy, and if anyone asked, the Paiutes alone were to blame. But they couldn't expect the Paiutes to keep their secret. After all, the Paiutes were angry with them for misleading them. In the planning of the attack, they had agreed to help the militia as a secondary force. But as things played out, the Mormon militia killed the men first, leaving most of the ugliest parts of the killing of the women and children to them. Not to mention that this was not at all what a standard native raid looked like. There is no historical evidence to show that a 4 to 5 day siege was a Paiute war tactic. Typically, a raid was focused on taking livestock and supplies, and even though people would get killed, it was not the cold calculations of setting up women and children to be slaughtered. Then there was the undeniable evidence of between 120 and 140 dead bodies lying where they had fallen in the meadow that were now being scattered by wildlife. Some of the men had tried to cover up the more obvious signs of the massacre. It would be difficult work, though. The field was still covered in blood, body parts were strewn around with clumps of hair caught in the sagebrush. The task was too great, and ultimately, the bodies were either left in shallow graves or essentially left to be exposed to the elements and scavengers. Despite their best efforts to conceal the event, word still spread to the surrounding settlements, and some even went to go see what had happened. Though it would soon become a place to avoid. There are accounts of travelers so overwhelmed by the smell that they couldn't bear being near the area. And over time, legends would form of trapped spirits and dark feelings. Despite the complete disregard for human life, there was little outrage in the community. At least it wasn't spoken comfortably. It was relatively easy for everyone to write it off as the work of a native tribe. These were people who shared a common goal of protecting their communities and saw outsiders as enemies. They had been prepped for violence, even if it was a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. Just 2 days after the massacre, Brigham Young's reply arrived from Salt Lake. It was dated September 10th, meaning that it was written 1 day before the false truce. It read, "In regard to immigration trains passing through our settlements, we must not interfere with them until they are first notified to keep away. You must not meddle with them. The Indians we expect will do as they please, but you should try and preserve good feeling with them. There are no other trains going south that I know of. If those who are there will leave, let them go in peace." Later accounts would tell that as John D. Lee read the letter, he shook as he said, "Too late, too late." This was True Crime of the Historical Kind. Thank you so much for listening. There will be a part 3, so please make sure to click the follow button or subscribe. And if you're enjoying the series or the podcast in general and feel so inclined, a positive review is always so helpful. Otherwise, just happy you're here. Until next time, bye.